Risotti.
Hi, and welcome to The Agenda with Crystal Risotti. I'm your host, Crystal. Happy to see you tuning in for the show. I want to bring up the last show that we started with, talk a little bit about that. It was the opening show, and I went through a list of all the different topics that I wanted to cover in this show. So if you missed that one, go back and watch it. This week, we're going to start with the United Nations and the communist goals. I want to do a deep dive into that because that kind of sets the precedent for the coming shows. I want to pique your interest on these types of topics because it's imperative that we are aware and educated on how these things are being done. So the United States was created as a sovereign country. The founders of the country left England, the tyrannical king. He was charging a lot for taxes. There was religious freedom issues, and they fled to this country. Everybody knows that at this point. But why were we created as a sovereign nation to begin with? We didn't want somebody else having a say-so over how we run this country. Our ancestors did not want that. They wanted to be able to run the country based on the values and the system that they wanted to have. Something that promoted individual responsibility and individual rights and individual freedom. Notice that the focus was on the individual. Also, they recognized that our rights came from God, not from the government. And they didn't want the government to ever be escalated to a point where we had to depend on the government to tell us what to do and to govern us. They wanted people to be self-governing. Now, why is that important? Fast forward to today, we have this lovely entity called the United Nations, and everybody's pretty much heard of the United Nations. Everybody knows what the UN is doing or trying to do, but I think there's a misconception about it. A lot of people think the UN is a good entity that's trying to promote good in the world, and I want to do a deep dive and talk about that because I think there are things that people just may not know. At my age, I knew about the UN for a long time. I didn't remember the history of it. So in that case, it's always good to go back to basics. But there, I believe, are generations now that don't even know what the UN is, what their goals are, what they're trying to do in the world, any of that, their impact, any of it. So I want to do a little deep dive on that. So the UN was born from an advocacy by President Woodrow Wilson. He felt strongly that the world needed a collaboration cooperative of countries to promote peace. And so there was something called the League of Nations that started in 1920 at the Paris Peace Conference. But the U.S. didn't join it initially. Well, over time, that League of Nations kind of fell apart. It fizzled out, didn't work. But in 1945, there was a UN conference on international organization. And that was following World War II. You have to think, countries were coming out of the World War. People didn't want a future war. So the main focus was world peace at that point, not having future wars. So at the time it was birthed in 1945, there were 50 countries that joined. They drafted the UN Charter, and that was adopted on June 25th of 1945. Their stated goals, according to a video on the United Nations website called What We Do, are maintaining international peace and security, protecting human rights, delivering humanitarian aid, promoting sustainable development, and upholding international law. Now, as we see with our current government, the organization, of course, grew and spread and grew tentacles into many other areas since the adoption of it. One thing I want to note that I've noticed is when people go into politics, at least in our country, they never take anything away. It's like their whole entire job is to create new laws, but they don't spend any time removing laws that don't make any sense anymore. unless you're the current administration and you don't like the executive orders that were put in about the border last administration. Then those get removed. But as far as laws on the books, they just don't tend to ever get removed. We have some stupid laws in America still on the books. I know at one point you couldn't eat an apple in Las Vegas or something stupid like that. Those are still on the books because the effort is always to progress. That's the term progressives. And it's always to create new things. Somebody wants to promote themselves and say, I did that. And so they just keep making more and more and more and more laws. Now, in turn, more and more and more and more of our freedoms are reduced and taken away. But that's another subject. This point, we have 193 member countries in the UN, including the United States. Josh, can you put up slide 1, please? This is a list of all of the UN-related collaborations and arms. And I just want to highlight a few of them that you may not have realized are part of the UN. UNICEF, World Wildlife Foundation, the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum. Most people knew those two. There's a branch called the UN Environment. There's the International Monetary Fund, which I myself didn't realize until recently that was part of the UN. I thought it was a separate entity. There's the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. Now that's dealing with the Asia Pac region, but it's all financial, right? So, thank you, Josh. So now let's talk about Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs as they're referred to, because those are the hot topic now with the UN. There was an Agenda 21 that was created well before 2021, but the goal was in 2021, these things will be accomplished. All right, so 2021 has passed, and now there's an Agenda 2030. So let's talk a little bit about what they are promoting through these agendas. Josh, can you play the video, please?
2012 is when leaders and citizens come together to put the world on a new path, a path to a sustainable future for our planet, to ensure that social inclusion, economic growth, and a clean and secure environment go hand in hand, to go beyond economic wealth as the only measure of progress. Sustainable development means meeting the needs of today and ensuring we can meet those of generations to come, lifting people out of poverty while protecting the planet's resources. It means equal opportunity, decent jobs, safe drinking water, sufficient food, quality healthcare, and education. Access to energy for all. Sustainable human development means a more secure world. This is the future we want.
That's such a cute little video, isn't it? It was from 2013. So, having said that, and watching this cute little video they put out, I want to talk to you logically and with reason about some of the things they said. They all sound like great things, so what could possibly go wrong? Let's look at some of the things they talked about they promote. Social inclusion. Now, I don't know about you, but what keeps coming to mind for me in the past few years since this has become such a hot topic and infused our society is anytime you include, you exclude someone else. And I'm seeing that a lot. I know you guys know the one demographic that keeps getting excluded. I'm just going to say it. Caucasian males.
Preach!
Thanks, Josh. At my work, we had these employee resource groups, and there were all these different groups, one for Pride, one for females, one Latino one for the African American group. the only one they didn't have a resource group for were Caucasian males. And it was funny because I ended up being in the Women's Empowerment Network thinking, oh, it's benign, not a big deal. And then last year, they started cross-pollinating all the groups. So they wanted all the group members to attend other ERG groups and become, quote, allies. So they opened the Women's Empowerment Network up and said, we want you to bring men now because they're our allies. That's the only place that I think a Caucasian male could go based on the topics of the other groups, unless they were not straight. But anyways, it's just ridiculous how crazy it's become. But we've seen an incredible uptick in that in this country, I would say in the past 10 years or less. It has infused our society. They want to be involved in jobs. Everyone needs a good job. All right, I won't even stop there. Education, they've infused themselves into the education system. Food supplies, everyone should have food supplies, plenty of food. Water, clean water, they're talking about. Healthcare. So I want to ask you a very poignant question. The World Health Organization is a global organization. How do you think they're going to make this happen worldwide? I'll give you a minute to think about that. The only way they can do that is if they're infused in each country and calling the shots behind the scenes. That's the only way. You can't ensure clean water globally unless you're pulling the strings behind every country that has water. You can't ensure food supplies and plenty of food for everyone unless you're behind the scenes pulling strings in every country. So I just want to point that out. Another thing that often comes to my mind, and I've said it so many times in my life, is he who pays the bills calls the shots. Now, you could say, well, we pay the United Nations to do things for us. And we do. But you don't think that money is getting infused back into certain countries through programs? We just saw the list of all the different programs they have. There's a payoff going on, I guarantee it. In addition to that, if they are, in fact, in these countries, these member countries, behind the scenes pulling the strings and guiding them, they'll always say, we just give them guidance. They're still sovereign. They can choose whether or not to do it. But just the most pertinent example that recently happened was COVID, the shutdowns. The World Health Organization, all they did was recommend that you lock down. They didn't make the member countries lock down. They're still sovereign, right? But the funny thing is, these member countries depend on that global entity to give those recommendations, and then they tend to act on them. So you may not have to act on them, but if you're a member country, you kind of do. We talked a little bit in the last show about the pandemic treaty that is it's in draft 0 right now. It's supposed to be released in May, and they're supposed to have a vote. These member countries, there's 134 member countries. They're all supposed to vote on whether or not to pass that pandemic treaty. And the UN has caught wind of the resistance from these countries' citizens against it. And so their response has been, well, again, we're just making recommendations. We're not forcing anybody to do anything unless it affects the people negatively or other countries' people. Well, think about that. What situation with COVID didn't affect the people and the people of other countries? We do global business all the time. People travel. They go back and forth between countries. Of course, it's going to have an impact on other countries, at least in their eyes. And it's going to have an impact on our citizens, at least in their eyes. There's always a sneaky way around it. It's almost like saying, we're not going to take your guns. You just can't buy any ammunition anymore. How are you supposed to use them? So in effect, they're right. They're not violating the Second Amendment that you can own one, but they're just going to make it so you can never use it. It's the same with this concept. Now, we know pretty much from the evidence that the United Nations is socialist or communist. Take your pick, depending on who you talk to. Both of them deal with equality and distribution of income. Socialism and communism both deal with that. They target that. I'm going to give a quote. Socialism is seen as the bridge between capitalism and communism. The major difference between socialism and communism is the method of takeover. Socialism and progressivism believe that it can centralize all control of the individual, land, and industry by peaceful but gradual legislation. Whereas communism seeks a violent and final confrontation to eliminate all dissension to achieve its utopian goal of a stateless and classless society. I'm going to go back to that comment about doing these gradual things with socialism through legislation. What were we just talking about earlier? Politicians go in to their office, they get elected into office. They are not going to remove anything. They're just going to come up with new laws and legislation. That's mankind. That's just human nature. So we are dealing with socialism. We have been for a very long time. Part of that, and you may not agree, but to me, is the welfare system. Part of that is Social Security. Part of that are these government programs that they're taking money from us as taxpayers and putting it back into the public. It's really a redistribution of wealth type of concept. That's nothing new. So let's look at the groups that are related to sustainable development. They list women, children and youth, indigenous peoples, non-governmental organizations or NGOs, you may have heard of those, local authorities, workers and trade unions, business and industry, scientific and technological community, and farmers. I'm going to say that pretty much ticks off all the boxes of everybody alive. Although, I didn't see one dedicated to men. But, they probably fit into one of those other categories. So those are the groups they're representing through these sustainable development goals. I want to go into a little bit about the Agenda 2030. So if we can go to slide 2. There are 17 goals as part of the sustainable development. I'm going to read off each one and what they actually represent. Goal number 1, you'll see it in the red box at the top left, is end poverty in all its forms everywhere. How do you think they're going to do that? Even Jesus said, you're always going to have the poor. How are they going to end poverty everywhere in all forms? Well, first you have to look at the definition of poverty. What does poverty mean? I know in the U.S. there's a poverty standard that they come up with, and it's a totally bogus formula for how they came up with it. It's the same as when they say, we have hungry kids in the U.S. Do you know how they determined that? They did a questionnaire with kids and asked them if they've ever been hungry. Do you know any kid who has never been hungry? That's how they're determining these statistics. So again, we have to break all this down and look at it critically in order to understand exactly what they're saying they want to do. Goal number 2 is, again, end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. What is sustainable agriculture? Because all I hear them complain about is methane from cows. All I hear them complain about is, cow farts. I'm going to say it as they call it. Different things that are coming out of agriculture that they complain about. Well, if the current agriculture isn't sustainable, quote unquote, according to them, then what is? You've heard the stories, and I'm going to tell you they exist. I've seen the videos of these incidents where Bill Gates with the Gates Foundation, which is also heavily tied to the United Nations, it's a funding source, talking about how we need to stop eating meat. We need to put insects. We need to use insects because they're high protein and they're sustainable. There are companies who are already putting that in food. You just have to know the code word and the ingredients to figure it out. Research this. I'm not telling you something that isn't already out there in plain sight for people who are interested and intrigued by it. We now have labs that are creating meat. I saw an article today where they're actually creating meat through a 3D printer. These things are crazy to me. Goal number 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Who determines what a healthy life is? Are they going by metrics? Because I can tell you, like the BMI index, I don't know about you, but it drives me insane. I don't think it's accurate at all. And a lot of people have said that in science, but it's still the standard. So what does healthy lives mean? I've been in the pharma industry for a very long time, and I can tell you a couple of things that I noticed. Number one, there's a flu shot that, went around in the 80s, and I happened to get one, and I got sicker than I ever would have been if I had just gotten the flu. And I did some research on it, and the scientists at my work kept saying, oh, you couldn't have gotten the flu from the shot. It's a dead virus. Something else that occurred to me, though, is they're giving everybody the same dose. So a 6'2", 250-pound man is getting the same dose as me that's 5'4" and a lot less weight. That could be a factor. There's so many different factors. I know with the recent vaccine that there are factors in that as well. If it was given in a vein, it wasn't supposed to be. They were supposed to aspirate first to make sure it wasn't in a vein. If it was given in a vein, it could cause problems. If the batch went out of temp control, it could cause problems. There were so many factors in that, right? So how do they determine healthy? What does that mean? And well-being, what does that mean? I don't even know what that means. It's too vague. Goal 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So this goes back to what we've been hearing about a lot lately on the free college tuition, forgiveness of the student aid loans. I am looking at this going, what is inclusive and equitable quality education? I don't take anything at face value anymore. What do they mean by those words exactly? Goal 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. I don't know if any laws on our books in the U.S. that exclude women and girls from anything. Nothing. If you do, comment and let me know, because I have no idea of any that are on the books. And what does gender equality actually mean? Goal 6, ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Now, again, all these things sound so beautifully nice and kind and virtuous until you start digging and using your critical thinking skills and thinking, what do they mean by that exactly? Because as a Christian, our enemy is always very, very good at hiding the truth, making things look like light when they're darkness. He's very deceptive. The Bible says he walks about like a lion seeking whom he may devour. I think there are people of their father on this earth. And so I don't trust things. I'm a skeptic, and I hope you will be too, because sometimes you dig into things and you do find that they're okay. But we should not just take things at face value. It's too shallow. Goal 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Well, we know what that means. I won't even stop there. Goal 8, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. I keep hearing in the U.S. that our unemployment is great, but I keep hearing from the other side that they're fudging the numbers. I can tell you a couple of days on LinkedIn, you're going to find how many people are desperate for a job. It's clear. I am one of them. Not desperate yet, but, getting there. Goal number 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. What does that mean? Again, what's sustainable industrialization? What is inclusive industrialization? No idea. Goal 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. Again, sounds great. But one of the things that's going on right now that's been in the news, the World Economic Forum, one of their goals is to basically do this through immigration. So you're wondering why we have the border problems we have? It's an initiative. There are sites set up all throughout the South America and Central America countries for people to go to. It's published. The Red Cross is part of that. Doctors Without Borders is part of that. They have stations set up where all these, I'm going to call them illegal immigrants, can go and stay overnight or get treatment or whatever. And they have maps for them to go to the next site and the next site and the next site. But you know where those stop? Our border. So one of the ways, again, that they're reducing inequality among countries is they're going to bring a lot of them into our country, because our country has always been seen as powerful and the biggest superpower in the world, essentially. We're very prosperous as a country. We are not a third world country. So let's use that as an example. When they talk about financial equality and equity, think about that. You can't, if I have $5 and you have $3 and we need to make it equitable, what are they going to do? They're going to take $1 from me and give it to you, which makes me poorer. Do you get that? Now, if you think that 1% of the rich is what you're focused on and you think they're just going to take it from them, they're not. Because guess what? You're rich compared to the homeless guy down the street. So you're vulnerable too. Be aware. Goal 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. I'm just going to keep reading. Goal 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Goal 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Goal 14, conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Goal 15, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. Goal 16, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Goal 17, strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. There's the 17 goals in a nutshell. I think you're going to see after we've talked through a few of these that the words they're using are so vague. You have to almost dive in and say specifically, what do you mean by this? Well, I can tell you, each goal has targets that are more granular than what we read. And at this point, there are 169 targets on answering the how they're going to do these things. So that brings me to, let's dive into the how they're going to achieve these and how are they going to enforce them. If you have a global entity and we're the United States and we're supposed to be our sovereign country, but we're a member country of the UN, how do they enforce them in our country? Through our politicians and our legislation, through their recommendations that we have to follow. Are we looking at something similar to an HOA to break it down and make it more relatable? I don't know about you, but I've lived in a few HOA type of homes. I will never do it again because of a couple of things. Number one, I don't see the logic in paying somebody to tell me what I can and can't do on my own property and in my own home. Do they provide some great services? Yeah, there's always a positive side. But ultimately, I'm not willing to forfeit that. Number two, I've seen it where we had a really great board or president. They move on and then we get a really bad one. And you can't control that. They control that. So I've had things like threatening letters sent to me because of leaving my dog chained out at the corner of the building all the time, and I never had a dog at that point. Our trash cans weren't put in the right place. Now your mailbox has to be replaced, and it has to be this certain color and this certain vendor that you can use that charges 3 times what you could buy it for elsewhere. That's kind of what I compare this to. We're the United States. We have our sovereign country, but we've now started to allow the UN to tell us what to do, and we're actually paying them money to do it. So they're calling the shots. All right, let's talk about who are the stakeholders in the UN. That's slide 3. This is the list that they give. Women, children, and youth. We talked about this a little bit before. Indigenous peoples, non-governmental organizations, local authorities, workers and trade unions, business and industry. It's crazy to me that they have their hands in all these different situations and with these different groups, considering them stakeholders. So again, these are people that they're going to serve. These are the people that they think matter, and that they're promoting themselves as serving. All right. I want to talk a little bit about public-private partnerships. If we could go to slide 4. Actually, go back to slide 3 for a minute, if you would. At the bottom, I want you to notice it says they organize special events, conferences, and forums where stakeholders from different sectors contribute to sustainable development initiatives. Additionally, the UN DESA Office of Intergovernmental Support and Coordination for Sustainable Development supports the participation of major groups and other stakeholders in governmental processes. They mention in their documentation, they mention public-private partnerships. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Slide 4 again. Let's go through this. Public-private partnerships create risks from the general public's and taxpayers' point of view. Private operators' partnership with the government may insulate them from accountability to the users of the public service for cutting too many corners. In other words, it's kind of like you've outsourced to a contractor, they've outsourced to another contractor, now something goes wrong and you can't get either one of them to own it because they blame each other. Providing substandard service or even violating people's civil or constitutional rights. At the same time, the private partner may enjoy a position to raise tolls, rates, and fees for captive consumers who may be compelled by law or geographic natural monopoly to pay for their services. So we've seen this a little bit ourselves in this country. We've got this big push, not just globally, but in America, for public-private partnerships. PPPs is what they're called. You'll hear that term a lot. Our government is pushing to partner with private companies. Case in point, Facebook, YouTube, they tried X, which was Twitter, but I don't think that's going to work out. But they're trying to really push for these public-private partnerships because the government, if they were in charge of things, are regulated. They can't do certain things. But those same regulations are not applied to private companies. Private companies don't have to adhere to those regulations. By doing a PPP and partnering together, the government is able to go around those regulations through the private company. And the private company has the backing of the government, so they often get money from us, taxpayers, to do whatever those officials want them to do. It's a beautiful setup. It's really genius. It's a way to get around the regulations. Let's go to slide 5. Lastly, as with any situation where ownership and decision rights are separated, public-private partnerships can create complex principal-agent problems. This may facilitate corrupt dealings, payoffs to political cronies, and general rent-seeking activity by attenuating the link between the private parties who make important decisions over a project from which they stand to benefit, and accountability to the taxpayers who foot at least part of the bill and who may be left holding the bag in terms of ultimate liability for the project's outcome. Key points: corruption, payoffs, political cronies. These are things that are potential risks with PPPs. You'll find links to the references for all of this below, so be sure to check them out. Don't trust me. Do your own research. Read. Preach. So why is the United States allegiance to the United Nations ultimately a problem? Why are we seeing so many drastic cultural changes happening so fast? I don't know about you. It depends on your age. If you're a millennial, you may have seen some of these. I'm in Gen X. I've seen a lot of things change in the past 10 years, maybe 20 years. So let's talk about that. I don't know if you're aware, I mentioned it on the first show, that there was a list of 45 communist goals that were discovered from a book called The Naked Communist, and they were read into the U.S. Congressional record in 1963 by Congressman Albert Herlong Jr., a Democrat in Florida. Let's go through some of these communist goals because I think this is going to answer a lot of questions for you about why our culture is experiencing the shift that we are right now and why it's so extreme and so fast. If we could go to slide 7. I'm not going to go through all the goals. You're probably sighing a huge sigh of relief about that, but we're going to highlight some of them because I think it's important for you to grasp the fact that this has been an agenda since 1963, even before that. And infiltrating our different institutions in America, they're able to push these through slowly. The communist goal number 11 says promote the UN as the only hope for mankind. If its charter is rewritten, demand that it be set up as a one world government with its own independent armed forces. Do you know they do have their own independent armed forces? And they are in the member countries. Just as an FYI. This goal, again, I can't stress this enough. These goals were written probably, I don't know when The Naked Communist came out, but it was well before 63. So this has been something they've determined to happen for a long time. Notice that in the goal, it calls out a one world government. So using the HOA as a scenario, if you don't pay your HOA fees, even if you're paying your property taxes, your mortgage, and everything else, did you know they could put a lien against your property? They can actually end up owning your property. They're not on the title, they're not on the deed, but they have that kind of power over you as a resident in an HOA-run subdivision or community. It's the same with the UN. The U.S. has given power over to the UN, and they have taken it and run with it. And they are a communist organization. They are trying to set up a one world government through communism and socialism. Slide 8, Josh. This one's interesting. Resist any attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. Back in the day, we had people that ran on the Communist Party in the U.S. in elections. And that was one thing I recall being an issue. Like, they were free to do that. So we've seen that come to pass. Slide 9. Capture one or both of the political parties in the U.S. How many times do we talk about it being a uniparty? The Democrats and Republicans, it's a uniparty anyway. It doesn't matter which side you're on because it's a uniparty. They all vote in tandem with each other. I've heard this so much, and I never saw it as much as I have in the past 10 years or so. Again, one that has come about very quickly, but it's very clear when you see it. Slide 10. Use technical decisions of the courts to weaken basic American institutions by claiming their activities violate civil rights. We're in this whole race battle again. I'm not the only one. I've seen other YouTubers talk about this. I grew up, I was a teenager in the 80s. We did not have racism then. We had fought it in the 60s. It was almost eradicated. I'm sure there were fringe people here and there that were still racist, but my generation wasn't. And now look at us. Here we are, and we're back to the race wars. It doesn't make any sense to me on how we got here, but it is an attempt to divide. Remember, united we stand, divided we fall. Let's go to slide 11. I bulked these together because there's quite a few of them that are recently enacted. Number 17, get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum. Get control of teachers' associations and put the party line in textbooks. As a conservative, as a Christian, I can tell you, I was involved in a parent group, and so I was following all of this, and I have a library at home of the vile books that have been found in public schools here in Indiana, where I live. I won't put them on social media. You can't read them on the State House floor because the adults don't want to hear it. It's too bad, but they give it to kids. We have the push for, I call it DIE, but technically it's called DEI, Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity, and SEL, Social Emotional Learning in the school systems. And those are fully in line with what they teach in colleges called CRT. They'll tell you CRT isn't being taught in schools. Well, it actually is through the SEL programs that are federal Department of Education. Remember, the Department of Education was always unique to each state until the Obama administration when they federalized it. So now all of our Department of Education is under one umbrella. They dictate that schools have to teach these things. And I infiltrated a all of Indiana, state of Indiana event where teachers and administrators and and all school employees attended. I was probably the only one there out of a couple thousand people that didn't actually work in a school. I have hidden camera video that I took where they were speaking about SEL and DEI in 2 different breakout sessions. I'm a big proponent of parent rights, and I was able to get them on camera talking about how they get around that with SEL. The other thing is, social emotional learning sounds like such a good thing. I mean, one of the tenets is respect for others. Who wouldn't want their kid taught that, right? The problem comes in, as a Christian at least, when respect for others turns into you have to call Johnny by this pronoun or this name, because if you don't, it's disrespectful. Now, you might think that's benign, and that's okay. You have your opinion. I personally don't think it's benign, because I have a significant story that's taking that times 10. And to me, it's all about living in a fantasy. Do we want our kids living in a fantasy world or confused? Who does the Bible say is the author of confusion? Not God. It strictly says God's not the author of confusion. So we know who is. Do we want our kids living in that, affected by that, impacted by that, and influenced by that? I personally don't agree with it. Number 18, gain control of student newspapers. I don't think I need to talk about that. Number 19, use student riots to foment public protests against programs or organizations that are under communist attack. I'm just going to dwell on the riots and protests part, because we're seeing that pop up at universities all over the country now. We have for a long time. Number 20, infiltrate the press. Get control of book review assignments, editorial writing, and policy-making decisions. We're seeing that happen with mainstream media in particular, but also these kids' books that are vile that I spoke about, that I have a library of, are award-winning books. They have fantastic reviews from very highly educated people. So I believe it's due to this. Number 21, gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. Seen that, can check that off the list. Number 22, continue discrediting American culture by degrading all form of artistic expression. An American communist cell was told to eliminate all good sculpture from parks and buildings. Heard that recently? Substituting shapeless, awkward, and meaningless forms. I don't understand the psychological impact of this myself, but I can tell you there's a whole lot of, in Indiana, whole lot of shapeless, meaningless forms all over a very influential city just outside of Indianapolis on the north side. Even in downtown Indy, even around the highways. And then we saw the massive attempts at taking down historical statues across this country just last summer. So there's that. Number 23, control art critics and directors of art museums. Our plan is to promote ugliness, repulsive, meaningless art. I can tell you, at least in my perspective, there's a president's son who's contributing to that and making a lot of money at it. Number 24, eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. And we're seeing that all over the place as well. We had a fight here in Indiana for taking obscene books out of the libraries. The left called it book banning, and I laughed because no one was banning books. You could still get them on Amazon. You can get them for your own kid. We just didn't want them in school libraries available to kids. And again, these are books that you can't even read on the State House floor. These are books I can't post the pictures of on social media. And their excuse is, but the law actually says if there's literary content in the book, that it could be considered okay. So they kept pushing that there's literary content in there. There's literary value in the books. Even though one book in particular called Crank, The whole book is for high schoolers, middle schoolers. It's a one-person account of doing crack cocaine with her father, a girl doing it with her father. There are rape descriptions in it. There are graphic descriptions of sex acts in it. There's drug use in it. There's alcohol use in it. There's drunkenness in it. I mean, what happened to the days when we thought we wanted pure things for our kids? We wanted to protect their innocence. Now it seems like the push is just to degrade them and take away their innocence. I didn't know where it was coming from, but look, it's right there in black and white. And the funny thing is, Indiana has a law on the books about obscenity, and it describes, there's a definition of obscenity in it. These books violate that definition. So people complaining that people just want a book ban and they want to take books out of schools and they don't want them available to anybody else. In fact, there's bookstores that have opened locally that the only books they carry are the ones on the bad list for kids. And they promote it and market it and they love it. If it violates the definition of obscenity and it's illegal for me to give a minor that same book outside of 500 feet from a school property or a public library property, if it's illegal and it's a felony, then guess what? It shouldn't be in a school. If it's illegal and it's a felony, it shouldn't be in a public library in the children's section. Would you give the kids a Playboy? Would you give them a Hustler? Whatever else is out there now? Everybody I've asked that to was like, no, we wouldn't do that. Well, then why would you give them these books with these illustrations of anal sex and all kinds of sex acts in them? Why is that okay? It's the same thing. Okay, off my soapbox. Number 25, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. We don't even need to talk about that because it's everywhere. Number 26, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. That's been going on since the 60s and 70s. Next slide, slide 12, please. Number 27, infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. Are we seeing that? I think so. Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch. I have friends who will not step a foot in church. They profess to be Christians. They will not step a foot in church. Again, they don't need to go to church in their mind. And that's okay. I'm not judging. I'm just saying this is falling in line with what this is describing. We have churches like, I forget his name, Robert Schuller. He's all about love, and Jesus was just love. But he doesn't talk about Jesus throwing the tables over in the temple. He doesn't talk about when Jesus was righteously angry. The Bible talks about a righteous anger. It's all about social. We have drag queens now that are pastors of churches in literal church buildings that are giving sermons and bragging about the LGBTQ agenda. They're not giving sermons on the Bible. They're giving sermons about love for LGBTQ people. That's it. That's social. Number 28, eliminate prayer or any phase of religious expression in the schools on the grounds that it violates the principle of separation of church and state. Separation of church and state doesn't mean what people claim it means. You have to think back to the history books. I know we've had revisionist history and you young people are not being told the true historical backing. But one of the main reasons that the Pilgrims came here from England was because of religious tyranny. They have a Church of England. They have a state church. And if you didn't worship at the state church, you weren't allowed to worship anywhere else in any other kind of way. You had to be part of that religion or none at all. They fled that because they didn't believe that way. All right? That was one of the reasons they came here, for religious freedom. So they're not talking about keeping churches out of state. They're talking about the founding documents are talking about keeping the state out of the churches. You won't find it in the Constitution either. It's not even in there. It was actually just in a letter. I believe James Madison wrote it. But they're talking about eliminating prayer, any phase of religious expression in the schools. They've already done that a long time ago. We know that. Number 29, discredit the American Constitution by calling it inadequate, old-fashioned, out of step with modern needs, a hindrance to cooperation between nations on a worldwide basis. That's going on all the time. We've now got generations who have gone through our universities and colleges who have been trained through the curriculum and education system, which who does this go back to? The United Nations. Hello. They have their hands and tentacles in education. And the communist or Marxist embracers that exist in our government. Number 30, discredit the founding fathers. Same thing. Present them as selfish aristocrats who had no concern for the common man. I've heard that more in the past year than I ever heard it in my life. So that's something that people are claiming. Number 31, belittle all forms of American culture and discourage the teaching of American history on the ground that it was only a minor part of the bigger picture. Give more emphasis to Russian history since the communists took over. Now that second part, haven't seen, could be happening, I don't know. But that first part, I've seen that happen. Talking about discouraging the teaching of American history. There's revisionist history going on all over the place, folks. If you can get your hands on history books from before the internet, do it. Number 32, support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture, including education, social agencies, welfare programs, mental health clinics, etc. Don't even need to talk about that. That's going on. Number 33, eliminate all laws or procedures which interfere with the operation of the communist apparatus. So we got one more slide, number 13. I'm going to try to go through these quicker. I won't elaborate on them a whole lot because I think they're pretty self-evident. Discredit and eventually dismantle the FBI. We have Republicans right now pushing to do that. I don't like the three-letter agencies myself at all. I don't trust them. I have no trust in them. However, I find it interesting that this is actually a communist goal, and we're doing that now. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on. 36, infiltrate and gain control of more unions. That's been done. Been there, done that. Number 37, infiltrate and gain control of big business. That's been happening. Again, one of the things with the United Nations is the ESG scores. We talked about that a little bit in the first episode, and I'm going to dive into that more in the next episode. But the environmental social governance scores that businesses are adhering to come from the United Nations, all right? They're embracing that. And as part of that, it shows me that big business is in line and aligned with the UN. Number 38, transfer some of the powers of arrest from police to social agencies. Now, I couldn't figure out, a couple years ago, why there was such a push for we need less police, defund the police, and we need social workers instead to go on the calls. That didn't make any sense to me. It seemed like it came out of nowhere. I was trying to figure out what they were talking about and why. Because my father was on the sheriff's department. So I grew up with that mentality. And trying to connect dots between social agencies and the police department didn't make a lot of sense to me. Why would you put your social workers, people that aren't trained like the police, in armed situations? Why would you put them in harm and shove them out to the forefront? It doesn't make any sense. Second of all, the defund the police thing didn't make any sense to me, because what's the first thing people do when they're in a dilemma? Caught in a robbery or being assaulted. They dial 911 to get police out. It's ignorant and naive to me. That's just me. Okay. 39, dominate the psychiatric profession and use mental health laws as a means of gaining coercive control over those who oppose communist goals. Now, I want to stop on that for a minute, because going back to the UN sustainability goals, they're talking about gender equity all over the place, right? So when they talk about mental health laws, know that that's part of it. Now, I'm going to be very clear here. Do I agree with the LGBTQ, gender ideology, all that stuff? I do not agree with that. Have I been unkind to people because they are in that group of people, that identification? No, and I will not be unkind to them because of that. Okay? So I want to be very, very clear about that. I don't believe that's how Jesus would treat them, and I can't treat them that way. They're humans just like me, and God loves them just as much as he does me. I may not understand what they've been through. A lot of times these people have had trauma, and that's the reason why they are. I want to dive deeper on a personal level with people. That doesn't mean that I support it on a general level, and I won't support it. I think it's anti-God. And as far as people having the impulses and saying, well, that's who I am, that's how I was made. Listen, I'm not going to lie, I'm a redhead. My natural self had a temper really bad when I was young. And I had to learn to rein that in and control it and behave myself and suppress and deal with it separately, okay? My natural instinct, if I hear a man mistreating a woman in particular because of abusive relationships I've had, my natural instinct is to come out swinging. I have to suppress that and try to tone things down with people. My husband has road rage. I'm not going to lie. He gets so aggravated on the roads. And what he wants to do is not what he does. We have to exercise self-control. One of the key signs of maturity is self-control. That's not a biblical concept. It's a reality concept. We all have impulses to do things we shouldn't do. Some of us are able to control that, have some self-control, and sometimes not in all situations. Others of us feel that impulse and act on it instinctively. We don't think about it. To me, that's just a difference in maturity. So having said that, going back to using mental health laws, I kind of went off the trails on that one. But they are using mental health laws to influence our society. They're using them to influence our kids. The CDC has something called WISC. It's Whole Community, Whole School, Whole Child Initiative. And the intention is straight from the UN. The CDC is in America. The UN is not. The intention is to bring on site at schools every possible service, mental health or physical health, that a child would need, so that parents won't have, number one, to leave their job to go take a kid to an appointment, and that's why parents love it. But there's a second piece to it. Kids can then be referred to these services without parental knowledge or consent. In that case, who is the authority of the kid? Not the parent. If the school is able to do that and not inform the parents, the parent isn't involved. And yet the parent holds the accountability and responsibility for the kid in the rule of law. It's not right. Moving on to number 40, discredit the family as an institution, encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. We've been seeing that for a long time as well. Number 41, emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents. Attribute prejudices, mental blocks, and retarding of children to suppressive influence of parents. We're seeing all over the country kids being taken from parents by DCS because they won't affirm their pronouns or their chosen new name. We're seeing that happen all over the place. We are seeing influences. You can find stuff on Reddit even. I found things on Reddit where teachers are talking about how they can't disclose things to parents because they're afraid for the child's safety. It's all over there. There's a Reddit subthread called Teachers or Ask a Teacher. You go through those threads and you'll see that. They're purposefully withholding information from parents, which in turn shows the child that their parents don't matter. They don't have to obey their parents or do anything with their parents. There's always this push. There's a channel called amaze.org on YouTube. If you go watch the videos, there's some about a trusted adult. I've heard that in the educational field a lot. Teachers want to now have relationships with the kids. They think that's important. And I understand on the outside it looks so good because, yes, I would love my kid to love their teachers, right? But if their teachers are cussing, if their teachers are playing along with games that they have in class that are using foul words, things like that, I don't think my kid needs to have a relationship with their teacher. Their teacher should be teaching them math, reading, and social studies and things like that they have to use in their life and not focusing on being their friend. Okay, so that's pulling kids away from their parents, calling themselves a trusted adult so kids don't have to tell their parents anything. They can go to a trusted adult. That's the new nomenclature in the educational front. Number 42, create the impression that violence and insurrection are legitimate aspects of the American tradition, that students and special interest groups should rise up and make a united force to solve economic, political, or social problems. Again, I don't even know that I need to go into this because we are seeing this all over the place as well. It's interesting to me that they say create the impression that insurrection is a legitimate aspect of the American tradition, though, because all we've heard about is insurrection, inciting an insurrection from 45, President 45. The funny thing to me is that as the conservatives said yesterday on a press conference, no one has been charged with insurrection and no one's been convicted of insurrection, including 45. But yet we have Democrats throwing that term out all the time and even some Republicans. So that's a little different from this 42. But as far as violence, special interest groups should rise up and make a united force. We're seeing that a lot. So thank you for bearing with me through all of those. There's a lot to go through, but I think it's clear that there's been an agenda in place for such a long time. We're just late to the party. And none of it's being taught. Very little of it, if any, is being discussed. There's nothing in the mainstream media about it for sure. And we're seeing the fruit of 3 decades worth of seeds being planted. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy fact. There is a conspiracy. It's not a theory. You just have to look at their own documentation to see it. It's in black and white. I want to end with John 10:10, some verses that came to mind. I mentioned this on the last podcast. I think this is going to become a theme verse for me. My pastor, it's his favorite verse, and it seems to apply everywhere. So John 10:10 says, "The thief," meaning Satan, "comes not but for to steal, to kill, and to destroy. I," meaning Christ, "am come that they might have life, and then that they might have it more abundantly." I hope that gives you a little hope because we're seeing the enemy at work so strongly. We're in the last days. I firmly believe that, and we're seeing him work so strongly to tear this world apart, to tear society apart, to pit one group against another and cause division and cause confusion. But Christ said, I came to give them life and give it more abundantly. Ephesians 6:12 and 13, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That verse stood out to me because we're talking about spiritual wickedness in high places. When you're talking about the United Nations, you're talking about the American government and other governments around the world. That is in high places. And they sound so virtuous, and these things sound so wonderful until you start looking at the how. It's kind of like the Code of Federal Regulations in America. They tell you what you have to do. They don't tell you how to do it. So you get flexibility around that in how you implement. It's the same with this. They're telling you they want to do these things, which are incredibly vague to begin with. But then you have to dive deep into the how to figure out what could go wrong. The second part of that, though, says, wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. I love that part of the verse, having done all. What are you doing? My pastor used to say in Virginia, I mentioned this on the first show, God didn't save us to sit, soak, and sour. So what are you doing? I want to encourage you to study. That's one thing you can do. Study. 2 Timothy 2:15 says, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And that's what we're trying to do in this show. Kind of rightly divide the word of truth. We're going to talk about some political things, obviously. We're going to talk about some educational things eventually. We're going to talk about a lot of different topics on this show. But the goal is to rightly divide it. And you can't rightly divide it without discernment from God, without applying it to scriptures to test it, and without discernment to read between the lines. So a critical thinking mind. You can't fix something until you acknowledge it exists. So that's the purpose of the show. Another thing you can do is share. Hebrews 6:10 says, for God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love, which you have showed toward his name, in that you have ministered to the saints and do minister. We are all called to be ministers in some form. We have to spread the messages to educate others, and that is to educate them about what's happening now, and also to save our country for our kids and grandkids. I don't believe we're called to just have faith in God and just leave it at that. I've battled with this. If Noah said, oh, I'm just going to have faith in God, I'm just going to trust him when the rains come, he'll take care of me, and had not built the ark, what would have happened? If David had said, I don't need to go fight Goliath, God will take care of us, I trust him, what would have happened? If Joseph hadn't saved up grain for 7 years when God told him to, because a famine was coming, and just said, oh, God will take care of it, he'll take care of us, what would have happened? None of them, and there's more stories that I can pull out of the Bible as well, none of those people sat, soaked, and soured. They didn't just say, oh, God's got this, he's in control, he'll take care of us. They did something. The apostles did not sit, soak, and sour. The apostles were out spreading the gospel. Now, this isn't a gospel message that I'm trying to share and spread, but I believe it's part of discipleship that I'm trying to spread and share this information. All right? So what are you going to do with that? And again, what can we do as Christians? Engage, study, start a local group, pray for the leadership, Get to know your local politicians. I know that's painful. It can be really painful, but get to know them. Run for office. We still have a small chance to turn things around, although the window's closing as we speak. Without God, we can't win. We know that. We need numbers. We have them. To me, I think we've been the silent majority, and it's time to be silent no more. I believe we have the numbers, but we can't activate the numbers unless people are willing to activate. We can't put those to use. You have to speak up. You have to be bold. You have to spread the messages. And personally, I used to follow national politics, but I didn't really follow local politics or state politics very much. One thing I can give you as a word of advice is that you need to look into that, because the only defense against the federal government is the state government and local government. It starts at the local. So there's a lot of power there. We need to utilize it. I thank you for watching the show. I just want to mention, if you like the content and you want to know more, be sure to subscribe, click the notification bell, and share. And also drop a comment. It helps the algorithms. It helps promote the show. If you think it was a good show, just make sure you're sharing it. And I'd like to say a special thank you to Revolver Broadcasting for producing the show. I have Josh here as the producer. He's amazing. And I want to encourage you all to check out revolverbroadcasting.com for more shows and content. And with that, signing off. Have a great night. Thank you.